Johnny Carson wasn't smiling anymore. If you watched The Tonight Show during the 1970s, he'd been the target of Don's humor dozens of times before. It was part of their dynamic. Doc Severinsen and the band were visible in the background, smiling at the exchange. Ed McMahon chuckled from his seat. Everything seemed normal, but Don Rickles wasn't finished. He leaned back in his chair and looked out at the audience. Then he turned back to Johnny with that familiar smirk. What he said next would later be described by people in the studio as the moment everything shifted. The joke itself seemed harmless at first. It was about Johnny's personal life, a reference to something that had been in the newspapers months earlier. Nothing scandalous, nothing that hadn't been discussed in public before, but the way Rickles delivered it was different. There was an edge to his voice that wasn't usually there, a sharpness that cut deeper than his typical material. He wasn't just making fun of Johnny Carson, the television host. He was making fun of Johnny Carson, the man. And Johnny noticed immediately. His smile didn't disappear all at once. It faded gradually, like someone slowly turning down a dimmer switch. The laughter from his throat stopped. His eyes changed. Don Rickles saw it too. For a man who had built his entire career on reading a room, on knowing exactly how far he could push before pulling back, Rickles had an almost supernatural ability to sense when he'd crossed a line. And in that moment, sitting 3 feet away from Johnny Carson under the hot studio lights, he knew. He'd gone too far. The audience was still laughing. They hadn't caught up yet. To them, this was still just another Don Rickles routine. But Rickles wasn't looking at the audience anymore. He was looking at Johnny's face, and what he saw there made him freeze. Johnny Carson leaned back in his chair. He placed both hands on his desk. His fingers drummed once, twice, 3 times on the wooden surface. It was a gesture that regular Tonight Show viewers recognized. It meant Johnny was thinking, processing, deciding how to respond. The studio grew quieter. Doc Severinsen stopped smiling. Ed McMahon shifted in his seat. The camera operators, who had filmed hundreds of these segments, sensed something was wrong. Don Rickles tried to recover. He laughed nervously and waved his hand dismissively, as if to say the joke didn't mean anything, but his laugh sounded hollow, forced. "Hey, Johnny, I'm kidding," Rickles said quickly. "You know I'm kidding." Johnny didn't respond right away. He just sat there looking at Rickles with an expression that was hard to read. It wasn't anger exactly. It wasn't hurt. It was something else, something colder. The silence stretched on. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15. On live television, 15 seconds of silence feels like an eternity. The audience began to sense that something was genuinely wrong. The laughter had stopped completely now. You could hear people shifting in their seats. Someone coughed. Don Rickles, the man who never apologized, who never showed weakness, who had insulted Frank Sinatra to his face without flinching, looked genuinely worried. He leaned forward slightly. "Johnny, come on," he said, his voice quieter now. "It's me. It's Rickles." And that's when Johnny Carson did something unexpected. He smiled, but it wasn't his usual smile. It was tight, controlled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "Yeah," Johnny said softly. "It's you." He picked up his pencil and tapped it against his desk. The sound echoed in the quiet studio. What happened next would be debated for years by people who studied that era of television. Some viewers who watched it live would later claim they knew exactly what Johnny was thinking in that moment. Others would say they saw genuine anger. But almost no one knew the real story. Because what was happening between Johnny Carson and Don Rickles in those 90 seconds of tension wasn't really about the joke at all. It was about something that had happened 7 years earlier, something that had never been discussed publicly, something that only a handful of people in the entertainment industry even knew about. And to understand why Don Rickles looked so panicked when he saw Johnny's face change, you have to go back to 1968. In 1968, Johnny Carson was already the undisputed king of late-night television. The Tonight Show was a cultural institution, but Johnny's personal life was in chaos. His second marriage was falling apart. The divorce proceedings were ugly and public. Newspapers covered every detail. During that difficult period, Johnny stopped going out socially. He avoided Hollywood parties. He showed up to the studio, did his show, and went home. The pressure was enormous. Not just from the divorce, but from NBC executives who worried that the negative publicity might hurt the ratings. One night, after a particularly brutal day of meetings with lawyers and network executives, Johnny sat alone in his dressing room. He was exhausted, emotionally drained, and Don Rickles walked in. They weren't close friends at that point. They knew each other professionally. Rickles had been on The Tonight Show several times. They respected each other's talent, but they didn't socialize outside of work. So when Rickles walked into Johnny's dressing room that night, unannounced and uninvited, Johnny was surprised. "What are you doing here?" Johnny asked. Rickles closed the door behind him. He sat down in a chair across from Johnny without being asked. "Listen to me," Rickles said, his voice serious in a way that few people ever heard. "I know what you're going through. I know it's hell, but here's what you need to understand." He pointed at the door, toward the studio where The Tonight Show was taped every night. "That show out there? It's bigger than any relationship, and you can't let them take it from you." Johnny stared at him. "Who's them?" he asked. "Everyone," Rickles said. "The lawyers, the executives, the newspapers, all the people who want to see you fail because it makes a good story. You can't give them the satisfaction." There was a long pause. "I didn't come here to give you advice about your marriage," Rickles continued. "That's your business. But I'm telling you this as someone who's been in this industry long enough to know how it works. The moment they sense weakness, they'll destroy you." Johnny didn't say anything for a while. Finally, he spoke. "Why do you care?" Johnny asked. Rickles shrugged. "Because you're good at what you do. And there aren't many people in this business who are actually good. Most of them are just lucky. But you're good. And it would be a waste if you let them take that away." Then Rickles stood up and walked toward the door. Before he left, he turned back. "And one more thing," he said. "When this is all over and you're back on your feet, I'm going to come on your show and insult you worse than I've ever insulted anyone, because that's my job, and you're going to sit there and take it, because that's your job." Johnny almost smiled. "Yeah? Yeah," Rickles said. "But here's the deal. There are some things I won't touch. Not ever. You understand?" Johnny understood. They never wrote it down. They never formalized it. But in that moment, an unspoken agreement was made. Don Rickles could insult Johnny Carson about anything professional. His suits, his golf game, his ratings, even his public relationships to a degree. But there were certain things that were off limits. Personal things, private things. The kinds of things that weren't material for comedy, and for 7 years, Rickles had honored that agreement perfectly. Until October 1975. Sitting there on the Tonight Show stage that night, Don Rickles realized his mistake instantly. The joke he'd made wasn't just about Johnny's personal life. It touched on something deeper, something that fell into that forbidden territory they'd never explicitly defined, but both understood. He'd broken the agreement. The silence in the studio felt suffocating. Johnny Carson continued tapping his pencil on the desk. His face remained neutral, but everyone who knew him could see the tension in his jaw. Don Rickles tried again to salvage the moment. "Hey, seriously, Johnny," he said, his voice taking on a tone that was almost pleading. "I didn't mean anything by it. You know me. I shoot my mouth off." Still, Johnny said nothing. Ed McMahon, who had worked with Johnny for years and knew his moods better than almost anyone, looked like he wanted to intervene but didn't know how. The audience remained completely quiet. And then, finally, Johnny Carson spoke. "You know what's interesting about you, Rickles?" he said, his voice calm but carrying an edge. Rickles swallowed hard. "What's that, Johnny?" "You make your living insulting people," Johnny continued. "That's your act. That's what people pay to see. And you're brilliant at it. You really are." He paused. "But the thing is," Johnny went on, "comedy is supposed to be smart. It's supposed to understand boundaries. Because without boundaries, it's not comedy anymore. It's just cruelty." The words hung in the air. Don Rickles' face had gone pale. This was worse than anger. This was disappointment. "Johnny?" Rickles started to say. But Johnny held up his hand. "We're going to go to a commercial," he said, looking directly into the camera. "And when we come back, Don Rickles is going to tell us about his new show." He turned to Rickles with that same tight smile. "Right, Don?" Rickles nodded quickly. "Right, Johnny?" The director cut to commercial. What happened during that commercial break became the subject of intense speculation for years afterward. The studio audience sat in confused silence, whispering to each other, trying to understand what they'd just witnessed. Was it real? Was it part of an elaborate bit? On stage, Johnny Carson stood up from his desk and walked toward the curtain without saying a word to anyone. He didn't look at Rickles, didn't acknowledge Ed McMahon. He just walked off. Don Rickles sat there, looking genuinely shaken. A production assistant approached Rickles nervously. "Mr. Rickles? We have about 90 seconds until we're back on air." "I'm fine," Rickles said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. Backstage, Johnny Carson stood alone in the narrow corridor that led to his dressing room. Fred de Cordova, the show's director, approached him carefully. "Johnny," he said, "we need to talk about how to handle this when you go back out there." Johnny looked up at him. "Handle what?" he asked. "The tension," Fred said. "The audience is confused." "We're not pretending anything," Johnny interrupted. "We're going back out there, and Rickles is going to promote his show, and then he's going to leave. That's it." Fred studied Johnny's face. "Are you okay?" he asked. Johnny didn't answer right away. "Do you remember what I told you when I took over this show?" Johnny finally said. Fred nodded. "You said you wanted to make television that respected people." "Right," Johnny said. "And part of that is understanding that there are lines you don't cross, even in comedy." He started walking back toward the stage. When The Tonight Show came back from commercial, something remarkable happened. Johnny Carson walked back out to his desk, sat down, and transformed completely. The tension in his face was gone. To anyone watching at home who had just tuned in, everything would have seemed perfectly normal. He turned to Don Rickles with professional warmth. "So, Don," he said, "tell us about the new series." Rickles, still visibly rattled, took a moment to compose himself. Then, like the professional he was, he shifted into promotion mode. He talked about his upcoming show, made a few self-deprecating jokes. Johnny asked follow-up questions, smiled at the appropriate moments, thanked Rickles for coming on the show. But anyone watching closely could see that something fundamental had changed. When the segment ended and Rickles stood up to leave, he hesitated for just a moment. He looked at Johnny as if he wanted to say something else. But Johnny had already turned to the camera to introduce the next segment. Don Rickles walked off stage alone. The aftermath of that appearance rippled through Hollywood for weeks. Rumors spread quickly. People who had been at the taping told their friends what they'd witnessed. Stories got exaggerated. Some people claimed Johnny had yelled at Rickles during the commercial break. None of that was true. But what was true was that Don Rickles didn't appear on The Tonight Show again for more than a year. For a comic who had been a regular guest, this absence was notable. People in the industry noticed. Publicly, both men remained professional. When reporters asked Rickles about Johnny Carson, he praised him. When Johnny was asked about Rickles, he called him one of the great comedians of the era. But privately, friends of both men knew something had fractured. Dean Martin, who was close to both Johnny and Rickles, later told someone that Rickles had called him the night after the incident. "I screwed up," Rickles had reportedly said. "I forgot the rules." Meanwhile, Johnny Carson went back to hosting The Tonight Show every night as if nothing had happened. Everything appeared normal on the surface, but people who worked closely with him noticed small changes. He was more careful about his guest bookings, more protective of his private life. Ed McMahon later said that the incident affected Johnny more than most people realized. Johnny understood that comedy could be brutal, Ed explained years later, but he believed there had to be honor in it, a code, and when someone broke that code, it hit him hard. 13 months passed. The Tonight Show continued to dominate late-night television. Don Rickles continued to perform in Vegas. Their careers went on. But everyone in Hollywood wondered if they would ever reconcile. Then, in November 1976, something unexpected happened. Johnny Carson was at a charity event at the Beverly Hilton. It was one of the rare public appearances he made outside of his show. Johnny was standing near the bar when he saw Don Rickles across the room. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither man moved. Then Rickles started walking toward him. Other people in the vicinity noticed what was happening and subtly moved away, giving them space. Don Rickles stopped a few feet away from Johnny Carson. "Hello, Johnny," he said quietly. "Don," Johnny replied. There was a long pause. Then Rickles spoke again, and his voice carried a weight that few people had ever heard from the insult comic. "I owe you an apology," he said. "What I said that night on your show was out of line. It was unprofessional. And more importantly, it was unkind. I broke a promise I made to you, and I've regretted it every day since." Johnny looked at him carefully. "You called it a promise," Johnny said. "I never thought of it that way. I thought of it as an understanding between two professionals who respected each other." "That's exactly what it was," Rickles said, "and I violated it. I got caught up in trying to get a laugh, and I forgot what mattered more." Johnny was quiet for a moment. Then he extended his hand. "We all make mistakes, Don," he said. "The question is what we do after." Rickles shook his hand, and the relief on his face was visible. "Does this mean I can come back on the show?" he asked, a hint of his old humor creeping back. Johnny smiled, a real smile this time. "On one condition," he said. "Anything," Rickles replied. "When you come on, you insult me worse than you've ever insulted anyone, because that's your job, and I'll sit there and take it, because that's my job." Rickles laughed. "That sounds familiar." "It should," Johnny said. "Someone very smart told me that once." 2 weeks later, Don Rickles returned to The Tonight Show. The audience gave him a standing ovation when he walked through the curtain. Johnny greeted him warmly, and within 30 seconds, Rickles was making fun of Johnny's suit, his hair, his golf game, but he never crossed the line again. The insults were sharp and hilarious, and perfectly calibrated to get maximum laughs without ever straying into territory that would cause genuine hurt. It was comedy performed at the highest level, and Johnny sat there laughing, taking every joke with grace, because he understood something important. The boundaries weren't restrictions. They were what made the comedy possible. Without trust, you couldn't be vulnerable. Without vulnerability, you couldn't be funny. And without those unspoken agreements, the whole thing fell apart. That night, watching Don Rickles insult him mercilessly while staying within the invisible lines they'd established, Johnny Carson was reminded of why he loved this business. Because when everyone involved understood the rules and respected each other enough to honor them, television could be magic. In the years that followed, Don Rickles appeared on The Tonight Show dozens more times. Each appearance was a masterclass in insult comedy. The incident from October 1975 was rarely discussed publicly. Most viewers eventually forgot about the awkward silence and the tension. But for the people who were there that night, it represented something important. It showed that even in comedy, where pushing boundaries is part of the job, there are some boundaries that exist for a reason. And that the strongest professional relationships aren't built on the absence of mistakes, but on how those mistakes are acknowledged and repaired. Years later, after Johnny Carson had retired, a reporter asked Rickles about his relationship with Johnny. "Johnny Carson was a gentleman," Rickles said. "He understood the difference between being funny and being cruel, and he expected the people around him to understand that too." The reporter pressed him for details. Rickles smiled. "Let's just say I learned, and I'm grateful I got the chance to." The footage from that October 1975 episode still exists in NBC's archives, though it's rarely shown. But the lesson from that night remains. Comedy is an act of trust. The comedian trusts the audience to understand the intent. The audience trusts the comedian not to abuse their vulnerability. And when that trust is broken, it takes real humility to repair it. Johnny Carson and Don Rickles both understood this deeply, and because they did, they created some of the most memorable moments in television history. Moments that made people laugh, not because the jokes were cruel, but because they were clever. That's what made their relationship special. Not the insults, not the laughs, but the respect underneath it all. If you remember watching Johnny Carson during those years, if you remember the way Don Rickles could make everyone laugh while somehow never making anyone feel genuinely bad, we'd love to hear your memories in the comments below. Those were special times in television, when comedy felt dangerous but safe, when you never quite knew what was going to happen next, but you trusted that everyone involved knew what they were doing. Tell us about your favorite Tonight Show moments. Tell us where you used to watch, because those memories matter. They remind us of a time when entertainment was built on talent, timing, and respect for the craft. And that's something worth remembering.